Welcome to a re-recording of the COVID-19 reorganization scenarios webinar that took place on April 9th. This is a re-recording of that original session because in my infinite wisdom, I completely forgot to record the original session. So I'm going to cover the exact same material that I covered in that particular webinar, and we're going to include some additional information that was raised in the Q&A of that particular session. So if you aren't familiar with what I do, my name is Leah Zaidi, and I am a futurist, for the lack of a better word. What I do is I combine foresight and systems thinking to solve complex problems. And that can range from things like science fiction prototyping to understand what new products and services from the future could be. But it could also include things like COVID-19 and understanding how the world is going to evolve as a result of this crisis and what comes next. If you haven't already looked at the document that I issued on March 24th, it is available on my website at multiversedesign.com. That particular document lays out what I think is the issue from a systems and foresight perspective. It also includes a wide spectrum of scenarios that could emerge within the context of COVID-19 and how the world could potentially look after this crisis is done. It's not a predictive document, it's a document based on possibilities, and you'll see a little bit more about that next as we go deeper into the presentation. So without further ado, let's dive in. What we're going to do is first start off with a level set on systems and foresight so that you understand the context under which this document was written and what it's trying to convey. In addition to that, we'll look at some considerations that might be important, particularly in terms of the predictive models that are rising around COVID-19. Then we'll go into the modular scenarios that I designed that you can use to do your work and to do strategy work to get a better understanding of how this thing might evolve. And so we'll go over some examples of how I use the document myself and to inform my own thinking. And finally, the Q&A that took place will be integrated into the talk that we're having right now. Finally, the Q&A that took place during that webinar will be addressed throughout this talk as well, so that we'll do our best to cover all the material that might have been pertinent to your understanding. Let's start off with systems thinking. At its core, systems thinking is understanding the relationships between the parts in order to better understand the whole. And the reason why we do this is because we want to understand how within a complex system, different parts influence and impact each other. So sometimes when we think that a particular aspect of a system is easy to intervene in or to impact or to change, that particular change can have, cascading effects on the rest of the system that we weren't quite prepared for. Within systems thinking, we want to acknowledge unintended consequences. The other thing that we look at within systems thinking that is really important is addressing wicked problems. So the nature of a wicked problem is such that, any intervention that you design, however well designed it is, however well-meaning it is, can have negative consequences and impact that we didn't quite foresee. So understanding the complex dynamics that exist within a system are really important when we're thinking about how we're going to intervene and how we're going to design better systems for the future. So one particular model that I think is important within the context of COVID-19 and understanding how COVID-19 is going to unfold is the Panarchy. Sometimes this is also known as the adaptive cycle or the eco cycle. So what this kind of describes is the cycle that natural systems go through. So if we think about this in the context of a forest, when a forest first comes about, it goes through a phase of exploitation where a whole bunch of new species move in, there's rapid sort of development, there's a lot of new dynamics and relationships occurring, and then eventually that settles into a conservation phase where everything stabilizes, a few dominant species emerge, and things become more or less established. Then from there on, we can see sometimes a release. So a release period is something like a forest fire. And what it does is that it clears the slate and allows for new things to emerge. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that what emerges within a reorganization is good or better somehow. It just means that it's something new. So when we consider this particular model, when we look at COVID-19, we begin to sort of understand how COVID-19 fits into our systems as well. We can take this particular model and apply it to the systems that we've constructed. When we look at this framework, what becomes apparent is that COVID-19 is what's known as a revolt. So a revolt is a fast-acting event that triggers a release period. And so we are going through a phase where our once stable systems are now being disrupted, and they're kind of being ripped apart in ways that we didn't expect them to be. And so the question now is, do we go into a reorganization period where new configurations come about, new dynamics within the system, or are we going to try and conserve the system that existed before? So for instance, reorganization can include things that are transformative, like universal basic income, but it can also include dystopic elements. For instance, if we see authoritarian governments taking advantage of the release period. So it doesn't necessarily mean what's coming after is good, right? So we have to remember that it's just new. In contrast to that, conservation is an attempt to keep the system as it was, and sometimes that includes creating strategies that allow us to do that. So for instance, the corporate bailouts that we're seeing in the United States are a good example of a conservation strategy that is attempting to keep the system exactly how it was before everything started. It's important to keep in mind with the Panarchy that the system that existed before we went into this release period will influence the system that comes next. So part of that is the fact that we're going to see, already existing tensions and already existing problems become even more strained and come to the surface in a way that we hadn't anticipated. So for instance, wealth inequality could get even worse as a result of COVID-19 creating a strain on the existing system. The system does have a tendency to want to remember what it was before things happened. And so we see this at play, particularly with the way we've constructed our strategies. So whether or not we go into a reorganization period that allows for something newer, that's more transformative, more positive to come about, is partly dependent on the system that we had in place before and whether or not there was capacity for that. So for instance, within the United States, we're seeing an attempt to avoid a release period into reorganization with the introduction of conservation strategies. So a conservation strategy, for instance, can look like a corporate bailout, when an entity that is no longer able to sustain itself isn't given that opportunity to go through a release period and reorganize into something new. Instead, it is conserved and preserved by a strategy that allows the system to maintain the status quo as it was before the release period. So now that we've had a chance to look at systems thinking, let's also consider strategic foresight, which is the other domain that has influenced the document that I released. So strategic foresight at its core is the exploration of multiple alternative futures, the many ways in which the world could evolve. And then once we've considered the many ways in which the world can evolve, then we step back and think about what are the implications of any given world on us. So we always look at it as a multiple. We always consider it as a spectrum of possibilities that could emerge. We never look at the future as just one thing that could happen. When we're looking at COVID-19, it's important to understand what the difference between forecasting and foresight is. So forecasting is really taking a set of trends, a wide spectrum of data, and narrowing down on a particular prediction about what is going to happen in the future. So we go from a wide set of considerations into a narrow outcome. Foresight is fundamentally the opposite of that. So we start in the future and we consider a wide range of possibilities, and then we work backwards in order to understand what the implications are for the present, given that any particular future might occur. So the difference here in terms of COVID-19 that's really important to keep in mind is that in terms of forecasting, the predictive models that are being released by epidemiologists and by researchers are really important to consider. That data is giving us insight into how we can expect things to unfold in terms of numbers. What it's not giving us is a qualitative picture in terms of how things could be, how life could change, the unintended consequences that the numbers don't really talk about. So for instance, the numbers don't talk about right now what the implications are going to be for mental health. That's something that we can explore through foresight work, not necessarily through forecasting. As of right now, both sets of considerations, forecasting and foresight, are important to look at. One important thing to keep in mind is that predictive models do evolve as our behavior changes. So the data that's being inputted into the models will be different if we behave differently. So it's important to keep that in mind going forward. Speaking of prediction, let's take a look at some of the models that were released at the early stages of the crisis that sort of informed the thinking behind the document that I put together. So it was suggested that a mitigation period that wouldn't completely squash the curve but bring it into a manageable space would be a mitigation strategy of about 16 weeks. And so I do think the Canadian government did take that into account, because we look at the relief packages that were released and they tend to follow about the same timeline as this particular strategy. Now, that's not to say that mitigation hasn't adjusted as a result of our behavior. It's possible that it could signal a return to work earlier or later, but that is just sort of a moving target that we set in the future. A full suppression strategy was approximately thought to be about 32 weeks, which is about 8 months. And so that would be what it would take potentially to flatten the curve altogether. The important thing to take into consideration around a strategy for, when we get back to work, or, whatever the normal that's emerging is a staggered start and stop. So it's entirely possible that if we go back a little bit too early, or if we go back, let's say, for instance, within the summer months, that come the fall, we might see a second wave, and then after that, a third wave. So that is a typical sort of trajectory for pandemics and for flus, that there can be a second and third wave, and that's something that needs to be accounted for. The other thing that you might want to take into account that was in the document was the time to vaccine. So a time to vaccine is currently estimated about 18 months. It's usually about a 12 to 18 month process to develop a vaccine. That's not to say that a vaccine can't come about earlier, and it's also not to say that it won't take longer than that. It's entirely possible that as we are developing a vaccine, that we see a new strain of the virus emerge as well. And in the larger context of things, the big disruption that we have to keep in mind is climate change. So, a lot of what we're seeing right now play out with COVID-19 is a reflection of what we're potentially going to see with climate change, except that I think climate change is going to be much, much worse based on the data that we have available to us right now. So in preparing for this disruption, we need to think about what's coming ahead as well. I am strongly of the opinion that any organization that was adequately prepared for climate change would have been better prepared for COVID-19, because it has so many similarities. Now, we are seeing some positive benefits for the environment as a result of the global lockdown and shutdown that we are all collectively experiencing. So, for instance, we're seeing a drop in air pollution. Because climate change and environmental unsustainability is a systems problem, it is highly complex, and it is probably one of the most wicked of wicked problems. And so as a result of that, we have to consider the fact that factors such as the increase of medical waste that's being produced right now is going to be problematic too. And it doesn't necessarily offset the air pollution, but it's another factor to consider and take into account. So there was a story that came out of Hong Kong quite recently that the beaches, the streets, the parks were being littered with things like masks and gloves, and that has long-term consequences as well that needs to be accounted for. Again, keep in mind that the planet is a highly complex system, and so an improvement in one area doesn't necessarily mean that the overall health of the system has improved. It just means in this case that we have potentially bought ourselves a little bit more time to address the problem. So let's now turn our attention to the modular scenario set that I created. So that particular piece of the document, that large poster that contains a whole bunch of columns and rows that articulate what a future possibility could be, is intended as a modular set that you can play around with. So within that document, every single line is a different possibility. They're not necessarily predictions, although quite a few of the things that were outlined in that document once it was released on March 24th have come true. Think of them instead as a spectrum of possibilities to work with. You can also think of each individual modular scenario as a piece of a larger prototype. So in and of itself, it may not present a completely nuanced and complex picture, but when you start to extrapolate it out and think of the second and third order implications of each of those particular scenarios, you get a much more nuanced picture. And then you can build even more complexity by taking, the individual pieces and combining them them together and thinking about the relationship that exists between them. And so that way we get a little bit more into systems thinking with our scenarios. The other way to use them is as signposts. So in Foresight, a signpost is something that indicates that a particular future is more likely to emerge than another one. So in this case, the futures are laid out according to 4 themes. So continuation, which is business as usual; discipline, which is order and control; collapse, which is a systemic breakdown, a complete breakdown; and transformation, which is high-tech and high-spirited. And so if we find that a particular element of a certain one of those types is occurring more often than others, then we can reasonably say that maybe we'll see more of that particular theme. So if once we look at the document, that'll become a little bit more clear in terms of what I mean, and we'll discuss it a little bit more. And so the final way to do this is to explore unintended and unexpected consequences. So we can look at how, within the context of a particular scenario, once we start to elaborate and construct those scenarios further, what can go right, what can go wrong, what is something that we might be blindsided by as well. So let's dive into the document itself. So you're not really going to be able to see this on your screen, but that's okay. Once you download the document, you'll be able to zoom in and see the individual lines further. So in terms of looking at this in pieces and considering it as a modular set, every single one of the lines that you see here in every single little box is a different scenario. So each of those lines is a particular modular scenario that you can then, again, extrapolate out or combine with others in order to create a more nuanced picture. So for instance, if I look at continuation in the philosophical, the first line there is commoditized panic. So what I could do is take commoditized panic and think about all the ways that that could potentially play out. I could look at the second and third order implications of that, for instance, through a futures wheel, which allows you to sort of put that idea at the center and think about, okay, what does that mean? What else could happen as a result of that? So that's one way to use this particular document. The other thing that I could do is I could jump across and I can start to pick out something, let's say, from political and continuation and transformation and art, and see how those particular things interact with each other and the new dynamic that could be formed if they come into play. The other thing you can do is you can work across a particular type of future to see what's emerging and to just work within that theme. So when we talked about signposts just a second ago, that's one way to look at signposts. So if I'm seeing that, for instance, through discipline, more and more of the potential scenarios and possibilities that are outlined in each of those boxes is emerging, then I can probably safely speculate that more order and control things could come about that are not within this document as well, but follow those themes and are consistent with it. So that's how a signpost could emerge. The other thing that you can do is work within a specific category, like going down one column and considering, for instance, what the political implications are across the 4 different themes. So for instance, you might have noticed that I'm using the 7 foundations model here, which is the model that I've created. And unlike STEEP, which is a model that gets used by foresight and forecasters quite often, which includes social, technological, environmental, economic, and political, these particular categories are expanded and allow for more considerations. The important thing to keep in mind is that you do need to consider a wide spectrum of possibilities and take into account various aspects of the system as a whole, because the problems that we're dealing with right now, particularly in terms of COVID-19, it's a very complex problem. And so the nature of a complex problem is such that, if you reduce it a little bit too much, if you take variety out of it, then what you could potentially do, or what you run the risk of doing, is removing the very thing that makes it complex to begin with. And so when you consider how to resolve an issue, how to deconstruct an issue, how to imagine a new future that could potentially replace what we have, you want to consider a wide spectrum of domains within the system and not narrow it down. So the 7 foundations really reflects the 7 aspects of any given system that I think are play at any given time that are core to how a system functions. And sometimes we tend to privilege some foundations over others. And particularly within the context of a pandemic, we really need to pay attention to the science. That's not something that we can ignore right now. The capacity for change and what emerges afterwards is also a reflection of how long the release period will be. So you might have noticed that in this document there is no timeline associated with these futures and with these scenarios. So any of these things could emerge at any given time. It really kind of depends on what we're seeing in the complex relationships that play out. Again, as I've mentioned, some of these things have already happened and some of them may not happen at all. So I'm going to quickly dive into some ideas that can help shape your thinking in terms of how you can use these particular modular scenarios. For example, if you combine fear with startups with prepping, that's all sort of scattered throughout the document, you get something like Panarchy. And Panarchy is a speculative organization that helps you hoard so that you don't have to. It could be a service that's a subscription based. So every 3 to 4 months, you get a box filled with all the essentials that people tend to hoard. And this could be a potential startup that could come out of the crisis that we're seeing, particularly if we default to a continuation scenario. Next, we have this idea of what happens when conscription and real-time tracking are combined with each other. So we could see a Minority Report for pandemics where we have hackers and health tech teams that are mapping pre-infection and isolation as a pandemic is about to occur or before a pandemic occurs. So we're already kind of seeing this future emerge. In Singapore, they're doing pretty aggressive tracking around movement of the pandemic and the COVID-19 virus. I shudder to think what will happen with the US and them applying this technology as well. I know that Jared Kushner has considered it. So it's something to keep in mind because it signals a broader issue beyond just looking at mapping of infection and isolation. And so you could take this particular idea and explore that even further. For instance, what are the implications here for a surveillance state? And if we look across and combine two things that we wouldn't think necessarily belong together and are part of two different themes, feudal lords and close-knit communities could lead to something like city-states. So in the process of having this document out, California has already declared itself a nation state, which has lots of implications. So, you could look at what it means for the emergence of city-states, the focus on local instead of global, having local supply chains, having close-knit communities that focus on keeping the community healthy and building resilience at that level. So there are implications that could be sorted out there. The concept of city-states itself could have lots of implications for other things as well that we haven't yet to consider. Now that you've had a chance to think about some ways that you could use this document, I want to remind you that I really think that this is only a part of the work that needs to be done. This is such a complex issue that there's research and considerations that need to come before. So for instance, you need to understand the system that you were in before all of this happened in order to understand where the system can go. And then beyond this point, to create future-proof strategies, which has within FORESIGHT an entire process associated with it. There's still a lot of work to do in between this document and that particular step. The other thing I want to remind you of is that this document is copyrighted, so if you do use it in any capacity, please do cite it. So now I want to jump into some Q&A and address some of the questions that were raised in the process of this webinar. Before I do that, I do want to remind you that I am available for consulting hours if you need to understand how the contents of this document apply to your organization and the best way to use them. I am also offering a discounted workshop that you can sign up for with me, and we can work through the particular challenges that you're experiencing as a result of COVID-19. To take advantage of that, all you need to do is reach out to me through the contact form on my website at multiversedesign.com. Before we end, I want to quickly address some of the questions that were raised in the process of the webinar that we had. And so there was a question that was raised around the relationship between trends, signals, and the scenario set. So personally, I'm not a big fan of trends because I think trends are a reflection of silos and not a reflection of systems. So what we often tend to do is we take inventory of everything that's happened and then we extrapolate that out into the future. And what I prefer to do is the opposite, which is start from the future and work backwards with a spectrum of possibilities, and then understand how to respond to multiple possibilities and multiple futures rather than, extrapolating things out from the present. One of the big issues that this sort of event has revealed is how many trend reports are now obsolete as a result of a big disruption. And so because trends are a reflection of the past, they don't necessarily reflect what is emerging and what is changing in the future. So we're speculating on the fact that, a particular trend as it was is going to continue being the way it was. That's really based on the world not changing significantly the way it has. So as a result of that, what I prefer to do right now is to look at weak signals. And in contrast to trends, weak signals are emerging issues that are on the fringe. And the way to sort of think about a weak signal is something that is one thing. So this one thing is really interesting, and that can be a story, it can be an individual, it can be a startup, it can be a community, a city, but it's really happening in one place. And so when we see something happening in one place that isn't happening elsewhere, we pay attention to that fringe signal and consider what are the implications of that if that were to become a trend in the future. So that's one way to consider the differences between trends and scenarios. I do like to create evidence-based scenarios and ground it in research, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your scenarios have to be grounded in trends. The other thing to consider about trends is that trends are also just one type of work. So forecasting work has its place and it can be important, particularly in the context of something like a pandemic, because we really do want to pay attention to the work being done by scientists, researchers, and epidemiologists. So in terms of trends, like those particular trends and that particular data is really important for considering in conjunction with the foresight work and the scenarios that we're looking at as well. Keep in mind, though, that trends are just one part of a bigger picture. So the way I like to describe it in terms of a metaphor is that trends are like sitting in front of a grand piano and hitting one note. You have a whole bunch of other notes that you can play as well, and comprehensive work includes using many different methods, many different frameworks and approaches. Another question that was raised was around stakeholders and how you account for future generations within the work. So what I like to do is once I create scenarios, I take different stakeholders into account. I think that's really important, not just for considering what the needs of future generations are, but also considering what the needs of marginalized communities and groups are within the present as well. And so once you start to work with the scenarios and you understand how things might evolve, the next step is to really consider what the implications of those scenarios are for a wide variety of people that you might be impacting, affecting, or that might come into play. And sometimes that means looking beyond the immediate stakeholders that you are working with into secondary and tertiary stakeholders as well, because again, from a systems perspective, everything is sort of impacting and influencing each other. So we want to consider how things that lie outside of our typical scope might impact us as well. Part of the reason why you want to consider marginalized groups in the context of the work is because it will disproportionately, COVID-19 will disproportionately affect marginalized communities, and that has all sorts of cascading effects for society as well. The reason why we might want to take future generations into account as well is because we want to account for how our short-term decisions and behaviors might play out down the road and impact others. So for instance, when we look at COVID-19, there's going to be long-standing cascading effects that will resonate far into the future, for instance, like mental health issues. The other thing to take into account when we're looking at other complex problems like climate change, those things can play out over the course of decades, not just, years. So we want to take into account how future generations are being impacted by what we're doing right now and whether or not we're setting them up for success and not leaving them worse off than we are. There are some governments and some organizations that are taking future generations into account in their work. It was brought up on the webinar that Wales has, a commissioner that specifically addresses that. Having particular roles associated with looking at future generations and taking their needs into account is a good first step, but eventually we need to get to a point where that consideration is built into all the work that we do. That's all for now. I hope that you got value out of this presentation and out of the document that I released. In the next little while, I will be producing more content that I hope will help contribute to your understanding of this crisis and help you navigate it a little bit better. In the meantime, do keep your distance, keep safe, and take care of yourselves as much as you can. Thank you again, and take care.